Welcome back to StoryZen, where every story begins with a moment you think you understand, until the truth changes everything. The moment he turned off the television and said, "Get out, old woman." I did not react the way people imagine they would in stories like this. There was no dramatic gasp, no immediate tears, no shouting, no emotional collapse that would make it obvious to anyone watching that something important had just broken. Instead, there was silence, a heavy, almost unnatural silence that filled the room so completely it felt like even the air had paused to listen. I was sitting in my usual chair by the window, the same chair I had chosen years ago, because it faced the evening light in a way that made everything feel softer than it really was. That chair had become my small kingdom without anyone noticing, not because it was powerful, but because it was mine. Or at least I had believed it was mine. Every evening, I would sit there during the news hour, not because I cared deeply about politics or world events, but because those 30 minutes were the only part of my day when no one interrupted me, no one asked me to move, no one treated my presence as temporary or conditional. That half hour was not entertainment, it was existence. It was proof that I still had a place in a house that slowly, over years, had started to feel like it belonged to everyone except me. His name was Adrian Cole, my son-in-law, though by that point the title felt meaningless. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He didn't need to. He had already decided what I was in his mind, a presence to be managed, a background character in a life he believed he was leading. He stepped in front of the television as if blocking it was the same as blocking me, reached out casually, and pressed the remote. The screen went black. The news anchor disappeared mid-sentence. And in that instant, something shifted in the room, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. Then he said it again, slower this time, as if explaining something to a child. "Get out! Go to your room! This space is mine now." The words were simple, but what made them dangerous was not their meaning. It was how easily he said them, as if ownership could be declared through tone alone, as if a lifetime of living in a place could be erased with a sentence. My daughter, Clara Bennett, stood in the doorway of the kitchen holding 2 grocery bags. I remember the sound of the plastic handles digging slightly into her fingers. I remember how she didn't drop them. I remember how she didn't move forward. I remember how she didn't speak. And I remember, most painfully of all, how she looked at me for just a moment, not with support, not with protection, but with hesitation, as if she was standing on a line she was afraid to cross. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Not about Adrian, about her, about me, about what this house had become when I wasn't paying attention. I waited for her to say something, anything, a correction, a defense, a reminder that I was still her mother, still a person deserving of respect in her own home. But she lowered her eyes instead, and in that small movement, something inside me became painfully clear. I was not being attacked. I was being quietly removed from the emotional structure of my own life. I stood up slowly. My knees ached, as they always did, but I ignored it. Pain had become something normal over the years, not just physical pain, but the kind of emotional discomfort you start accepting because resisting it feels more exhausting than enduring it. Adrian had already turned his attention away from me, sitting down on the couch as if the matter was already settled. He unlocked his phone, the glow of the screen reflecting on his face, and began scrolling like nothing significant had happened. That was perhaps the most disturbing part, not the insult, not the command, but the normalcy he returned to immediately after it. As if I had already ceased to be relevant the moment he spoke. I walked toward the hallway without saying a word. Behind me, I heard him laugh softly at something on his phone. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Don't forget your glasses, you'll need them in your room." A joke, or maybe not a joke, it didn't matter. The intent behind it was clear enough. I was being reduced, not removed violently, but repositioned quietly. In the hallway, the house felt different. Not physically, the walls were the same, the lights were the same, the photographs were still hanging in their familiar places, but something about the atmosphere had changed. It felt like I was walking through a space that had stopped acknowledging me. I passed the mirror near the entrance and saw my reflection briefly. A woman I recognized, but only partially. There was a time when I used to feel like the center of this home. There was a time when my voice decided what happened in these rooms. There was a time when I believed that permanence was something earned by time spent, by effort given, by care invested. But standing there, I realized something that felt like a quiet collapse inside me. Permanence is not given by time. It is given by recognition. And I was no longer being recognized. My hand reached the bowl near the door automatically. Keys. The sound of metal touching metal was louder than it should have been. I paused for a moment, staring at them. Keys are strange objects. They represent ownership, but also permission. Control, but also access. In that moment, I wasn't sure what mine represented anymore. Behind me, I heard Clara moving slightly, as if she had shifted her weight but still hadn't decided to act. That silence hurt more than Adrian's words, because cruelty from a stranger is expected. Silence from family is not. I didn't look back at her. I didn't ask her why she wasn't speaking. I already knew that answer would hurt more than I was prepared to carry in that moment. Instead, I opened the door. The air outside was cooler than I expected. It didn't feel like escape. It felt like suspension, like I was stepping out of one version of reality without knowing what the next one would be. I didn't slam the door. I didn't hesitate either. I closed it gently, almost politely, as if I were leaving a place I intended to return to. But deep down, something had already shifted. I walked down the steps slowly, the sound of my own footsteps unusually loud in my ears. And for the first time in years, I became aware of something I had been ignoring for a long time. I had been shrinking. Not physically, not literally, but in presence, in voice, in decision-making, in space. Each year had made me slightly smaller inside my own life, until one day there was barely anything left to notice. When I reached the street, I didn't know where I was going. That realization should have scared me, but it didn't. Instead, it gave me a strange sense of directionlessness that felt almost honest. I stopped at the gate and looked back at the house. It looked normal, ordinary, unchanged. And yet I knew something irreversible had just taken place inside it. Not because I had been thrown out, but because I had finally been made aware of something I had refused to see. I was no longer being included in my own story. A taxi passed slowly on the road ahead. I raised my hand without thinking. It stopped. And as I opened the door and stepped inside, I didn't realize it yet, but that single movement, that decision to leave without asking permission, was the beginning of everything that would follow. And I still didn't know it, but the moment I left that house, I didn't lose my life. I started remembering it. The hotel room was smaller than I expected, but it had something my house no longer had: silence that did not belong to anyone else. It was not the kind of silence filled with tension or anticipation, not the silence of waiting for someone's mood to shift or footsteps to approach or a door to open with uncertainty behind it. It was clean silence, uninterrupted silence, the kind that does not ask you to adjust yourself. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving, listening only to the faint hum of the air conditioner, and I realized something strange. I had forgotten what it felt like to exist without preparing for interruption. Every room I had lived in for the past years had felt temporary, even when I was told it was mine. Every movement I made in that house had been adjusted, softened, measured, as if I was always aware that I might be disturbing someone else's authority. But here, in this unfamiliar hotel room, there was no authority competing with me, no presence watching, no expectation shaping my behavior, just me and the quiet realization that I did not know what to do with it. I opened my bag slowly, almost hesitantly, as if I was afraid of what I might find inside it. At the bottom, wrapped carefully in a thin plastic folder that had yellowed slightly with time, was something I had not looked at in years: old property documents. Papers I had kept not because I needed them daily, but because I had once believed that truth does not disappear simply because it is ignored. I spread them across the small desk near the window, and as the city lights outside began to glow faintly against the darkening sky, I started reading. My eyes moved over familiar words: ownership, registration, title, sole proprietor. At first, it felt distant, like I was reading about someone else's life. But then the name appeared. My name. Margaret Hale, sole owner. No co-signers, no transfers, no shared rights. And in that moment, something inside me did not just shift, it corrected itself. As if a distortion I had been living inside for years had suddenly snapped back into alignment. The memory of how that house became what it was began to surface slowly. My husband had built it with me, not just financially, but emotionally. Every wall carried decisions we had made together. When he passed away, the house did not feel empty. It felt like continuation. And when Clara moved in years later with Adrian, it had felt temporary. A phase. A situation that would eventually resolve itself. They needed time, they said. Just a few months, they said. Then the months turned into years. and somewhere along the way I stopped noticing when temporary became permanent. That is how erosion works, not through force but through delay. Nothing happens all at once. Everything happens slowly enough that you begin to believe it is normal. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. For the first time, I allowed myself to remember the version of me that existed before all of this. I used to work at the county records office. I used to deal with documents like these every day, verifying ownership, correcting errors, identifying fraudulent assumptions, resolving disputes between people who all believed they were right. I remembered how clear everything felt then, how truth was not emotional, it was procedural. It either existed on paper or it did not. There was no in-between, no negotiation with reality. Somewhere along the line, I had forgotten to apply that same clarity to my own life. I had allowed emotion, guilt, and family to blur lines that were never supposed to be blurred. My phone buzzed on the table. The sound startled me more than it should have. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. Then another buzz. Clara. I did not answer immediately. I let it ring once, twice. On the third ring, I picked up. Her voice came through quickly, slightly panicked, slightly confused. Mom, where are you? Adrian is asking what happened. He says you left the house. There was something strange in the way she said it, as if my leaving was the unexpected event, not what had led to it. As if the natural state of things was me staying silent in a space where I no longer felt seen. I am at a hotel, I said calmly. Why would you go to a hotel? She asked. You could have just gone to your room. You didn't have to leave like that. That sentence hit something deeper than I expected. Go to my room, as if I had simply been reassigned within my own life. As if leaving the living room meant I still belonged somewhere in that house. I closed my eyes for a moment. Clara, I said softly, did you hear what he said to me? There was a pause, a long one. Then she replied, he was angry. You know how he gets sometimes? He didn't mean it like that. That was the second twist, though I didn't call it that yet. Not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't say. She did not deny it. She did not defend me. She did not correct the disrespect. She explained it. And in that explanation, something became painfully clear. The environment I had been living in was not just controlled by him. It was accepted by her. Silence was not passive. It was participation. I am fine, I said finally. But where will you stay? She asked. I will decide that, I replied. Another pause, then her voice softened slightly. Mom, don't make this bigger than it is. There it was, the minimization, the familiar shrinking of something serious into something manageable, something that could be ignored if labeled correctly. I ended the call shortly after that, not out of anger but out of recognition. Continuing the conversation would not bring clarity. It would only bring repetition of the same pattern I had already lived for years. I sat back down at the desk and looked again at the documents. The words did not change, but I did. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something inside me began to reorganize itself. If the house was legally mine, then the story I had been living was not just emotionally distorted, it was structurally false. That realization did not feel like victory. It felt like correction. Like waking up in a room you had been misinformed about for years, I thought about Adrian again, not as a threat but as a pattern. The way he spoke without hesitation. The way he occupied space without permission. The way confidence can sometimes disguise itself as authority. He had not taken anything from me physically. He had simply behaved as if resistance would never come, and I had validated that belief by not offering any. I stood up and walked to the window. The city outside was moving in its usual rhythm. Cars, lights, people unaware of the small collapse happening quietly in one room of one hotel. And yet inside me, something had already begun to shift into motion. Not revenge, not anger, something more deliberate, something closer to structure. I picked up my phone again. Scrolled through contacts I had not touched in years, names from another version of my life. One stood out, Daniel Price, property law consultant, former colleague. Someone who always understood documents the way I used to. I stared at his name for a long time before pressing call. He answered on the second ring. Margaret, he said, surprised. It has been a long time. I need help, I said simply. There was no hesitation in his voice when he replied. Tell me what happened. For the first time since I left the house, I realized something important. I was no longer explaining my situation to be understood. I was explaining it so it could be corrected. When Daniel Price said, "Tell me what happened," I expected myself to hesitate, to soften the truth, to package it in a way that sounded less absurd, less heavy, less impossible to explain in a single breath. But I didn't. For the first time in years, I spoke without filtering myself for someone else's comfort. I told him about the television, about the words, "Get out, old woman," about Adrian's voice that carried the strange confidence of someone who had never been questioned inside a space long enough to believe he could be. I told him about Clara standing in the doorway, silent in a way that felt louder than anything Adrian said. I told him about leaving the house, about the hotel room, about the folder, about the deed, about the name that confirmed what my life had been legally even while my reality had been emotionally rewritten. And as I spoke, something strange happened. I stopped sounding like someone asking for help and started sounding like someone stating facts. Daniel did not interrupt me. That was the first sign that I had chosen the right person to call. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line, not the uncomfortable kind, but the calculating kind, the kind that belongs to someone who is mentally reorganizing a situation into structure, law, consequence. Then he spoke. "Margaret," he said carefully, "this is not a family misunderstanding. This is a possession issue being treated emotionally instead of legally." That sentence alone felt like someone had opened a window in a room I hadn't realized was suffocating me. He continued, "If the house is solely in your name, then there is no shared claim, no implied ownership. No verbal arrangement overrides legal title unless documented. What you're describing is not a dispute, it is unauthorized occupancy." Unauthorized occupancy. The words did not feel dramatic, they felt precise. And precision, I realized, was something I had been missing for a long time. Emotion had been the language of my house for years. Be patient. Don't escalate. He's stressed. She's trying. But none of those phrases ever touched reality. They only softened it. Daniel's voice did not soften anything. It clarified. "We will do this properly," he said. "No confrontation, no emotional engagement, paperwork first. Enforcement second. You will not go back into that house alone." That final sentence surprised me more than I expected. Not because it was restrictive, but because it assumed protection, something I had not felt in a long time. I agreed without argument. After the call ended, I sat still for a while, phone still in my hand, as if it had become heavier. Outside the window, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that something small but irreversible had just begun inside one room. I should have felt fear, or guilt, or hesitation. Instead, I felt something closer to alignment. As if my life had been slightly tilted for years and someone had finally placed it back onto its correct axis. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I expected. Not because I was anxious, but because my body no longer had the same tension that used to keep me half awake in my own house. There were no distant sounds of arguments disguised as conversations. No footsteps that required interpretation. No silence that felt like waiting for something to break. Just stillness. Clean, uninterrupted stillness. At exactly 9:14 a.m., Daniel texted me, "We are initiating notice delivery. Stay where you are." I read the message twice, then set the phone down. Somewhere across the city, in the house I had left, life was continuing as if nothing had changed. That thought would have once comforted me. Now it felt irrelevant. At 9:48 a.m., Clara called. I answered. Her voice was different this time, sharper, more unstable. "Mom, someone is here. A man. He says he has legal documents. He asked for Adrian." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Yes," I said. "What do you mean, yes?" She asked, "What is happening?" "Did he give you papers?" I asked calmly. She said, "He said it's a notice." Was a pause. I could hear movement in the background, voices overlapping, tension rising through sound alone, then her voice dropped. "Adrian is furious." That part didn't surprise me. "What does it say?" I asked. There was a rustling sound, paper shifting. Then silence as she read. Her voice changed as she continued. "Notice of termination of occupancy, 30 days. She stopped. Then she said quietly, "Mom, what is this?" And that was the moment the third twist fully revealed itself, not in action, but in recognition. Because up until that point, Adrian had been behaving as if confidence was enough to define ownership. But paper does not recognize confidence, it recognizes structure. "It means," I said slowly, "that he is not the owner." Breathing changed. "But he said." "I know what he said," I interrupted gently. "But what matters is what is true." Voice erupted in the background, Adrian. Loud, uncontrolled. Words I couldn't fully make out, but the tone was unmistakable, disbelief turning into panic, panic turning into anger. Clara came back on the line. "He says this is a mistake. He says you can't do this. He says," "Clara," I interrupted again, more firmly this time, "listen carefully. This is not an argument, it is a legal process." Followed, not acceptance. not understanding, just pause. Then she said something quieter. Why didn't you tell us? That question lingered longer than the others because the answer was not simple. I did not think I needed to, I said finally. And that was the truth that neither of them had considered. That silence from me had never meant surrender. It had meant tolerance. The call ended shortly after, not dramatically, just disconnected. I stood up and walked to the window. The street below was unchanged. People still walked to work. Cars still moved. Life still performed its illusion of normality. But somewhere inside that normality, a structure was beginning to shift quietly, legally, inevitably. By noon, Daniel called again. Notice delivered, he said. He refused to sign acknowledgement, but that doesn't matter. It is served. His reaction, I asked, a brief pause. Predictable, anger first, denial second, then attempts to reinterpret reality. I exhaled slowly. And your daughter? He asked. She is still there, I said. Not for long, he replied. That sentence stayed with me longer than expected, because I realized something in that moment. I was not just removing someone from a house. I was removing a system from a life, and systems resist. That afternoon, my phone began to vibrate repeatedly. Messages from Clara, short at first, then longer, then fragmented. The internet is off. Adrian says you're punishing us. The card stopped working. He says you can't just. I didn't reply immediately. I sat with each message as it arrived, not reacting but observing. For the first time, I could see the pattern clearly. Dependency had always been invisible when it was working. It only became visible when it broke. Finally, I typed one response. Nothing is being taken from you. Access is being corrected. I set the phone down. Minutes later, it rang again. Adrian, I answered. His voice was immediate, sharp, unstable. What the hell are you doing? I said nothing. You think you can just shut everything off? You think this is normal? It is legal, I said calmly, a laugh but not humor, frustration. Legal, this is my home. No, I replied quietly. It is not. Silence, then his voice lowered. You are doing this because you're angry. That assumption, that clarity must be emotion, almost made me smile. I am not angry, I said. I am informed. That was the moment something shifted in the call, not loudly, not dramatically, but noticeably. Like a door closing in someone's understanding. You don't understand what you're doing, he said finally. I looked out the window again. I said, you don't understand what has already been done. I ended the call. For the first time, I did not feel like I was participating in chaos. I felt like I was observing its collapse. And somewhere inside that collapse, I could already sense the final phase approaching, the moment where denial runs out of language and truth becomes unavoidable. The final phase did not begin with noise. It began with silence, but a different kind of silence than the one I had lived with for years. This silence was not heavy, not oppressive, not filled with unspoken tension waiting to explode. This silence was procedural, structured, official. It was the silence of systems moving forward without emotion, without hesitation, without negotiation. I learned this the moment Daniel Price sent me the message that simply read, "Final enforcement scheduled. Do not return to the property until notified." I stared at those words longer than I expected, not because I was uncertain, but because I realized something important. Everything that had once felt like emotional chaos was now being handled as administrative reality. And somehow, that felt more powerful than anything I could have shouted or demanded. Clara called once that morning, but I did not answer immediately. When I finally did, her voice was different again, not angry this time, not confused, but tired. The kind of tired that comes after prolonged resistance to something inevitable. "Mom," she said quietly, "they came again." I didn't ask who they were. I already knew. "They said we have to prepare to leave." There was a long pause after that sentence, as if she was waiting for me to react emotionally, to soften, to reverse, to become the version of myself that once prioritized comfort over truth. But I did none of those things. "Okay," I said simply. That single word seemed to disorient her more than anger ever could. "Okay," she repeated. "That's it." I walked toward the window in my hotel room and looked outside at a city that had no idea a life was quietly shifting inside its structure. "Clara," I said gently, "this was never about punishment. It was about reality catching up to behavior." She didn't respond immediately. I could hear movement in the background, drawers opening, voices overlapping, tension rising in layers I didn't need to witness to understand. Then she said something quieter, almost fragile. "Where are we supposed to go?" That question would have once broken me. It would have triggered guilt, urgency, emotional rescue. But something inside me had changed too fundamentally for that response to exist anymore. You will figure it out, I said, not cruelly, not coldly, just truthfully. And truth, when it is finally spoken after years of avoidance, always feels sharper than intended. Later that day, Daniel called again. His tone was different this time, not procedural, but conclusive. They have vacated the property, he said. I didn't speak immediately. Not because I was surprised, but because I was trying to understand what I expected to feel in this moment. Relief, victory, satisfaction, none of those arrived. Instead, there was a stillness inside me that felt almost unfamiliar. Any issues? I asked. Minimal resistance, he replied, but it ended as expected. The house is legally clear. Then he added something after a pause. You should come see it when you're ready. I didn't go immediately. That decision surprised even me. Instead, I stayed in the hotel room for a few more hours, sitting quietly, allowing the reality of what had happened to settle fully. For so long, I had imagined this moment as something dramatic: confrontation, apology, emotional resolution, some form of visible closure. But reality rarely provides theatrical endings. It provides absence, and absence is quieter than expected. When I finally arrived at the house, the sun was beginning to lower, casting long, soft shadows across the street. The gate opened easily. The lock turned without resistance. There was no dramatic pause, no emotional buildup, just access restored. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was not damage or disorder, it was space. Space that I had forgotten existed. The living room no longer felt crowded with presence. The air no longer felt conditioned by tension. Even the silence was different, not occupied, not charged, just empty. I walked slowly through the hallway. Every step echoed in a way I hadn't heard in years. The walls looked the same, but they felt different, not physically changed, but emotionally unburdened. There were faint marks where furniture had been moved, small reminders of presence that had recently been removed. But nothing felt permanent except the realization that I was no longer walking through someone else's control. I reached the living room and stopped. That was where it had all begun. The chair by the window was still there, my chair. I approached it slowly and sat down. For a moment, I didn't think about Adrian. I didn't think about Clara. I didn't think about legal notices or money or consequences. I simply sat in the space that had once defined my entire sense of daily existence. The sunlight fell across the floor exactly as it always had. The world outside continued its rhythm without interruption. But inside me, something had fully completed its shift. This was the final twist, not the removal of people, not the enforcement of law, but the realization that nothing had been taken from me at all. What I had experienced was not loss. It was delay of recognition, delay of truth, delay of boundaries that should have existed long before the front door opened. I didn't move immediately. Clara stepped inside first. She paused when she saw me sitting there, not afraid, not angry, just uncertain. Adrian was not with her. She walked slowly into the room as if testing whether the space would reject her. It didn't, she said softly. I looked at her, but I didn't stand up. Not out of distance, but out of stability, she took a breath. He's gone. I nodded slightly. I know. Was a long silence between us, not uncomfortable, not emotional, just real. I didn't know what was happening until it was already happening, she said finally. I believed her, but belief did not require reversal. I know, I said again. She looked around the room. It feels different. It is different, I replied. Another pause. Then she asked the question that mattered more than all the others combined. What happens now? I considered that for a moment, not from the perspective of punishment or reconciliation, but from structure. Now, I said slowly, you learn what life looks like when nothing is assumed. She lowered her gaze, not in defeat, but in understanding beginning. I stood up finally and walked to the window. The same window I had sat beside for years. But this time, I wasn't looking out of it from a place of limitation. I was looking out from a place of ownership, not of property alone, but of clarity. I will always be your mother, I said quietly, but I will not return to a life where I am invisible in my own existence. She nodded slowly, not resisting, not agreeing fully either, but accepting something irreversible had already occurred. That night after she left, I walked through the house one more time, not to inspect it, not to reclaim it, but to understand it. Every room felt like it had exhaled something it had been holding for years. The silence was no longer a warning. It was neutral, clean, balanced. I turned off the lights one by one. And when I reached the hallway, I paused for a final moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I was aware that the story I had lived for years had ended not with destruction, but with correction. And as I closed the door behind me, gently, without force, without anger, I understood something I had spent too long forgetting. Sometimes you don't lose your life. You simply stop living inside someone else's version of it. And that is where freedom begins.